All right,
Oh,
we are live with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon, and today I am super excited to welcome a good friend and colleague, Aaron Scheidies. Aaron, welcome.
thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have a great conversation about a really good, interesting topic.
Yes, I've never had a bad conversation with you, and I expect more of the same today. And the broad topic you and I were contemplating is this broader issue of whether we should be playing sports or not playing sports here in the middle of a pandemic. And part of what would be helpful is for folks to understand your perspective you're coming from. So, can you give a little background for those who aren't as familiar with some of the great things you do in sport?
So I'm a blind, vision impaired triathlete, but I've also uh, dabbled in multiple other sports. I went to the Rio Paralympics in cycling because my category wasn't in triathlon, and have done multiple marathons, Boston Marathon 5 times. In triathlon, I've won, I think, 8 world championships, and basically I've always tried to stay on top of whatever sport situation I've competed in, and now just trying to put a medal around my neck for the Tokyo Paralympics in 2021.
Yeah, an odd number after a very odd and challenging 2020 that we've all faced.
Yes, for sure. And I think the key thing is that everybody has their own situation or story, and call it dilemma with the COVID thing. And I think we all have to have an open mind about not just thinking that our viewpoint is the only viewpoint, because there's many out there that they, oh, well, the pandemic should be our main focus and everything, and we shouldn't be doing any sports. We should only be focusing on basically staying home and staying healthy and call that be. But the problem with that is you're looking at it from a telescopic view, or a tunnel view of the consequences of doing that are also possibly just as bad or worse. So I think it's always in life a balance. Those people that say, oh, we shouldn't be doing sports and we shouldn't be doing this and that. Well, there's a good percentage of people that sports are what makes them happy. And so if you're staying at home and just sitting and doing nothing, well, we're already going to have a major issue with increase in alcoholism and stuff like that. But quite possibly, maybe these sports that we're having at least televised and we can't attend are quite possibly helping prevent some people from entering, alcohol and drug abuse. So there's a major, just big picture that I think we kind of need to look at.
So you raise a really fundamental question in talking about some of the importance of sport, which is why do we even do sport to begin with? Set aside the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And for you, you're someone who has constantly met obstacles by showing resilience, right? So you've fought legal battles to participate in sport. You've got 2 young boys that make it challenging. You balance a job outside of sport, and yet you're always returning and dedicating to sport. And it raises an interesting question. Why is sport so important to you and to others from your perspective?
I think that just like any other, I guess, I think that many people, sport is what has brought them passion, has brought them happiness, has brought them maybe to get out of difficult situations, and brought them kind of freedom from maybe some other barrier. Has people, sport teaches people a lot of great qualities, hard work, teamwork, dedication, accountability, all those things. And so I think, although a lot of people look at sport as, and they're looking at the big major sports as, oh, it's just, a business and a big moneymaker, which yes, it is. But the thing is that many of those people that are participating in those sports, um, that sport becomes part of who they are and intertwined into their actual human existence. So I think it's really important. I have a very, very interesting situation because especially with the COVID related issue, because, like you said, I'm an athlete, but I also work, now part-time because I'm watching my two little ones kind of full-time, and my wife's working full-time, but I work in a skilled nursing facility, which is right on the front lines, working with the most vulnerable population and being in high risk situations all the time. And then on top of that, just last year, 1 year from now, or from basically a few days from now, our 20-month-old almost died from RSV, which is a respiratory infection that is somewhat similar to COVID. And he was, literally, we almost lost him. So he's still in the compromised population stage. So, and then I'm also an athlete myself. So, I'm looking at it from a perspective of, I'm seeing every day the patients that are the most vulnerable. I come home to a child that, had a respiratory condition and is on a compromised situation. But I also realized that sport has changed me as a person and is part of who I am. So I really kind of can see it from all perspectives from how people look at our situation right now.
So let's try and give some voice to those perspectives. So, from the perspective of someone who is on the front line and who does have a son who is vulnerable and had a really scary situation around a respiratory illness already, what are some of the arguments against sport? And I'd love to also follow that up with, what are the arguments for sport from the athlete's perspective?
I think the arguments against sport potentially would be, especially like the pro athletes, the college athletes, and whatnot. These athletes are maybe getting tested all the time, and I, being someone that is working with vulnerable populations or in contact with people that could be infected, have a hard time getting a test, and potentially favoritism or unequal treatment to those that are professional athletes versus those that are just your typical citizen. I think that's kind of the question. And so maybe too is just, like with the crazy spike right now we're having and the hospitals being, to the capacity, the level of care being potentially less if I was to get in the hospital, or my son or whatnot, what would the level of care be? And where do we need to be focusing on the sport aspect of it versus that? Even though I'm on the front lines, I don't necessarily agree with that. I actually think that the other side of it, obviously, is that we support playing sports. I think it's really important to always mitigate the risk, do whatever you can to reduce increasing transmission, but still letting sport happen. There's been very little high incident or high severe cases of kids that get it, and they could potentially transmit it. I'm not totally sure. It's still undecided. But college sports, professional sports. I think that right now it's important for us to have professional sports, and for some people to have an outlet to at least kind of keep them from getting in some difficult, challenging situations. So I think it is important for us to have sports right now, despite our current situation.
Hey, you highlight some really important divides that we face when we're talking about these types of issues, which is some folk perceive sport to be, in some ways, an ancillary activity to the fundamentals of society. And others, and I tend to be more in your camp, for some obvious reasons, see sport as in fact some of the few ways we still drive and connect as society.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the ways in which we prevent so many other challenges that we face, whether it's some of the things you highlighted earlier around addiction or other, bad variants that we can spend our other time in, but also just fundamentally being healthy and both mentally and physically during this time that has put tremendous stress on families and everyone else.
Yeah. And I think, I'm obviously trying to on the road to Tokyo, and I think that the Olympics have always been, it's always been a time to, for the most part, set aside our differences in countries, and beliefs, and a time that we focus on the accomplishments of different athletes, and a chance to kind of unify. I would say, I think typically during Olympic time periods, you don't typically there's not so much of the issue of talk about race and discrimination and all these other sort of bad blood against different countries. And it's our time to kind of unify and bring all countries together. And, I think, although I think it's going to be hard, I think that it would be a good idea to, again, try to push to have the Olympic, Paralympic Games as much as possible, within reason, obviously, as long as we can keep from preventing crazy transmission. And, I think the major obstacle would be is most all countries, even the small countries, need to have access to vaccination and whatnot. So that's, I think, a big issue too, because then people also talk about, well, these athletes are getting the vaccination and who maybe not be getting the vaccination from each country because the athletes are. So I think that's the major kind of issues of conflict of values.
Yeah, and for you in the past 9 months of the pandemic, have you been able to compete? Have you been able to find platforms to do that, or has it been pure training mode? And what does that look like for you so far?
No, I mean, March 9th or whatever it was this year, I was basically the night before ready to go and do the U.S. kind of selection race for the team for the Paralympics. And they said the night before it was a go. We woke up in the morning at 6 a.m. in Sarasota, Florida, and got an email that it was all canceled, and we all went home. And then from there, there's been no races, competitions. And well, my training has been all over the place, non-existent pretty much for a few months, because everything shut down, all the pools and everything shut down, all the facilities. I do have a home gym in my house, so that's good. But the access to the pool has, come back midsummer. So I've been able to get back to doing that, to swimming, but it's so I have to schedule it over a week in advance, and then I have to schedule babysitter coverage. And up until about a month ago, I got this Boost 2020 grant from Global Sports International that really is helping me get babysitter coverage. But other than that, I just have to schedule everything so far ahead, and there's no flexibility. So it's definitely challenging. And then coming home, every night where myself or my wife may have been exposed to a potential positive case, and what's the most important thing at that moment, your decisions are very challenging.
Yeah, in many ways, you exemplify this daily decision making that we're all making about where to put our energies and where to put our resources that we have right in the middle of a pandemic. And yet you provide a really good example and compelling example for why sport remains important in a lot of ways for many.
Yeah, I mean, if people didn't have sport and an outlet to at least be active, I mean, that is a major, basically, medication for a lot of people. Sport and activity and a healthy lifestyle is the medication to prevent mental illness in a significant amount of our percentage of our population. And so if you just say, well, we're going to shut down the doors of everybody, because not everybody has a home gym like me, not everybody has sort of other access and whatnot, but you have to be able to realize, okay, we're going to mitigate some risks. We're going to do the things that we need to do to try to prevent transmission, but we still need to realize that these things are important.
Yeah, it's interesting too. There's a lot of press that will happen when you see some positive cases in the NFL and some of the other professional leagues. There's a lot of conversation that then comes down to shutting down the league, shutting down all sports, shutting down certainly participatory sports. And yet, if you look at the data, I'm sure you've seen some of this as well. Even the leagues that are struggling with COVID are outperforming society at large with their protection and their risk management. And
Yeah.
gym data has been really compelling. URSA and actually some of the students I work with at the Oregon Consulting Group have been doing a study on gyms and COVID. And the story is actually quite a positive one, that with the proper protocol in place, there's very little transmission that's taking place in those contexts.
Yeah, yeah, and I was really worried about our governor shutting down the pools here because there's been no transmission from swimming recreation pools, and so they didn't. We have 12 people in the pool at a time, 2 people per lane, but there was concern that they'd shut down the pools, and I was just like, there's no evidence to show that that's a reasonable thought, because if there's no evidence of transmission, then why do we need to shut them down? So that's the whole kind of thing of it. There's a big part of population that just, just shut everything down. Well, that's not the best thing to do for long term, because shutting down everything, you all, especially with shutting down all the workplaces, you've then created massive homelessness populations and massive economic issues, and then massive mental issues. So I think it's always a balance, and people need to realize that there's a value to sport, and there's a large percentage of the population in our country that sport, or at least active lifestyle, may be like one of the biggest important, in like columns of their, kind of different things that are important to them that people value. And so we all have our values, and some people value, different things other than others. And I think that there's a major value to sport.
I mean, certainly, prior to this last flare up, we had a lot of situations where you had all sporting events canceled in certain communities, and yet bars and indoor dining and shopping and some of these other activities open. And I know a number of athletes I've been working with and talking to struggle with that reality, where it's staring them in the face that their neighbor could be at a bar without a mask, pretty close to someone else for hours on end, and they're not allowed to go to the local swimming pool, as you were saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think that everybody needs to put politics and that kind of stuff aside and just look at this issue. And that's my whole mission in everything I do, is see different with Aaron. Everybody needs to look at these situations from other people's perspectives and not just their own. What we do right now and our decisions can have impacts on others. And we need to not just realize that, well, whatever I think is what everybody should think, and what we should do right now is the best decision for us to do, because you also have to think about the future too. So I think in every situation, we always have to put ourselves in the other person's perspective and look at their situation and get kind of think of it through another set of eyes.
It's such an important point. In some ways, what you're saying is someone who may not value sport as highly as you or others do needs to at least be open to the idea that sport is fundamental to many people's lives, and to help try and figure out some ways to allow for sport in ways that aren't causing undue risk, but are still allowing us to participate in these really important, critical parts of our lives.
Yeah. I think again, I'm not saying that we, just do sports free willing. I'm saying, we wear masks when we need to wear masks to prevent things. We test when we need to test. We allow crowds and fans back in when it's deemed safe from a medical perspective. But we don't need to just shut down everything or open up everything. It's got to be a gradual progression. We have to value sport, value people's values, and set aside politics. This is not a political issue.
So we are heading into the next phase of this pandemic, where we are starting to thankfully have some really promising vaccines here on the horizon and starting to be administered, at least in the UK and soon in the US. From your perspective, where would athletes in sports be in that line of, and you know this from many perspectives, being on the front line, working with at-risk populations, having at-risk folk in your own home, where would you put that in the priority given the scarcity of resources from your perspective?
I mean, my perspective would probably be, I think obviously the most vulnerable population get the vaccines first, and the people that are working with the most vulnerable populations, so they don't bring it into those populations. But in terms of, let's say, pro athletes, things like that, I think athletics should go on. But what I think they should do is actually not necessarily give the vaccines to all the pro athletes, but more so in this time of delegating the vaccinations, more so put those sports. I think what the NBA did in putting them in a bubble I mean, these guys, I know they have families and whatnot, but they are also making a ton of money. And, maybe they need to realize that part of why they're making so much money is and I liked how the NBA did it, and they put everybody in a bubble and they had to stay in the bubble and you couldn't go outside the bubble. And if that's the case, those guys don't need the vaccinations right now. So don't, I know that they make a lot of money and it's a business and they could probably get access to it because, I think a lot of, with power and money, you can get almost everything in this country. But I think we need to, just because they're doing sports and they're involved in sports, I don't think that they need the vaccinations first. I think putting their sports in a bubble, all the major sports, so those guys aren't continually going back and forth to their families and whatnot, but having shorter seasons, more condensed seasons in a bubble, and then working on the rest of the populations around the world outside of that.
Great insights and great thoughts. And as we start to wrap our conversation, I want to finish with a couple of things. One, I would love to hear your final thoughts. And I also would love for you to share ways that our audience can follow along with you as you do work your way towards Tokyo, and probably one of the most challenging moments for an athlete to find their way to international competition at that caliber in the middle of a pandemic with all the things going on. So first, any final thoughts, and then how can they follow you in your path?
I think the final thoughts is that, well, one, in this situation where we can all of us probably feel overwhelmed and just feel like that the world is against us. I think we need to just stop when we're having those overwhelming thoughts and just take a deep breath and tell ourselves it's going to be okay. Because most likely for 99.9% of the population, or I should probably say more like 98% of the population, it's probably going to be okay. So I think we need to not always think about, okay, I'm going to be that one person that has the bad issue, because the statistics don't show that, and do all the steps to prevent it, but realize that it's going to be okay. And have trust in the medical fields that they're there's going to be some different cases and instances of side effects and whatnot of different things, but I think we have so many people in the world working on this situation that it's going to be okay. I think that's really important to stop the anxiety train going. Second of all, people can always follow me on Instagram at Aaron_Scheidies, Twitter at Aaron Scheidies, and then my Facebook fan page is at See Different with Aaron. So my last name is Scheidies, and Aaron, Aaron. My website is www.c, the letter C, the word different, the word with, and Aaron, Aaron.com.
Fantastic. And as always, a huge admirer and have tremendous respect for everything you do, and really appreciate our conversation and sharing your insights and your thoughts today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh.